Why did Abahlali Basemjondolo decide to vote EFF? And what lessons are there for undecided voters in this 2024 election? Let's get into it. Spread the fire. This is SMWX. I'm Tessa Dooms, and I'm here to talk to you about the 2024 elections. It's less than 30 days before we get to the 2024 elections, almost like 3 weeks at this point. And we have to start talking about who are we going to vote for? What are we going to do with our ex? There are many undecided voters in this country. I would hazard that there are more people who are undecided than people who are absolutely sure what they're going to do with their ex on the ballot. And last week, Abahlali Basemjondolo, a social movement in KZN, based primarily in KZN, but now national, made a pronouncement that they would be voting EFF in this election. And so people have been asking questions about why they did that, what were the reasoning, are they now EFF members? But really what Abahlali have done is they've decided to make a tactical decision with their vote. They're using their vote in particular ways. I want to explore what they might be using that vote for. Because ultimately, Abahlali is not necessarily just voting for the EFF. They are making a decision about what their vote needs to do. And I think as we decide what we're going to do with our ex, the question isn't so much who are you voting for, but what do you want your vote to accomplish? What is the vote for? What is the vote going to do when you place your ex? Sometimes we fixate on parties and we fixate on personalities during an election. And I think that on the one hand, that constrains us. It limits our thinking in terms of our vote. I personally am tired of being asked, who are you voting for? As if it's a beauty contest and I'm just deciding on a pageant winner. Because the way I make the decision about who I vote for has to be about more than who I like, who I don't, who I support, who I don't. It has to be about what outcome I'm pursuing. And in a voting system like ours, in an electoral system like ours, that isn't winner takes all, right? It's not like what they do in the US, where you have these two candidates and whoever gets the most votes wins. They don't even have to get 50% of the vote. They just have to get the most votes. And then they win and they take the presidency, and that's that. In our system, we have a multi-party democracy. And that means that we're not just voting for one party to be the winner. We're not voting for winners and losers. We're voting for representatives that will form parliaments, that will form structures of government, that will form cabinet, and ultimately will choose a president. And I think that there's more to this than just deciding who we're voting for. And that's what I want us to discuss today. So Abahlali Basemjondolo deciding to vote for the EFF is going to be our case study. And I want us just to unpack why they've made that decision, or at least come up with reasons why we think they've made that decision, and what it helps us think about in terms of making a decision as an undecided voter. So people were very curious about the fact that they made this public announcement. Why would they feel the need to make the announcement public? Let's start there. Abahlali is voting as a group. They're not just voting as individuals. And I've spoken before on this channel and many other platforms about the idea of making voting a group assignment, that we as voters need to talk to each other about our vote and vote as a collective, the way political parties do. They vote as collectives, right? Why is this important in terms of announcing particularly who you're voting for as a collective? Because it speaks to your voting power and your ability to get political parties to listen to you. Abahlali has over 150,000 members across the country. The majority of those members would be adults. The majority of those members would be registered adults, especially as a movement that is political in its nature by the fact that it contests for political space and ideas on a day-to-day basis. It's not a political party, has never been a political party, and won't be a political party. But it does have a membership, much like other social movements in the country. I think of Macau, which is a mining community's social movement, also has membership. Equal Education is a membership of mainly teenagers, but also parents and teachers fighting for equal education in the country. They also have membership, but they don't have to be political parties. But they can decide how they use their voting block or their voting power together to make an impact. So if you have over 150,000 members, as Abahlali does around the country, what you have is an opportunity to say, we represent somewhere between 5 and 6 seats in parliament, depending on what the turnout is in the election. The more the turnout is, the fewer seats they represent. But let's use last election's turnout. It took about 35,000 votes to 50,000 votes to get a seat in parliament. And that range is because in different provinces it would be different, but also because the way the remainders of votes work is that the smaller parties aren't always getting the same amount as the bigger parties to get a seat. But we've spoken about that in a previous video. The point is that Abahlali is looking at it and they say, we represent a certain number of seats in parliament. And so that makes it attractive for political parties to actually go and engage them. It's not just one voter. And one voter doesn't represent a seat. It doesn't represent a percentage. But Abahlali represents a few seats in parliament that's worth considering. And that's the power of voting as a collective. So even by deciding to announce that as a collective they're voting, they've already started to make a strategic voting decision. They're being tactical in their approach because they're not just saying, here is one vote. They're saying, here are a few seats that are up for grabs for your consideration. What do we get as the voter in exchange for the seats that we represent? So that's one thing already for us to kind of take note of in Abahlali's approach. But by making it public, they're also doing two things. One is they're giving some reasons for their choice of the political party that they will vote for. And the reasons that we've seen so far are that they've said they've put together 20 criteria, 20 policy issues that they're looking for in people's manifestos, in the manifesto of different political parties. And they're saying that the EFF's manifesto measures up to their expectation closer to the other political parties. So they're telling us that there are issues on the table. And for an organization like Abahlali Basemjondolo, who, for those of you who don't know, is a shack dwellers movement that is advocating particularly for issues around housing and land in urban spaces, the land question would be a really important part of that, and how that is addressed for Abahlali, I'm sure factored in greatly into what their demands were. So they get to make a public pronouncement about having actually evaluated the different policy positions of different parties. So it's not just, I like this party, I like this person, I think Julius is cool, or I'm impressed with their campaign. They're saying there's a policy set of things that there's alignment on. But the other thing to think about is whether they're voting because they trust that the EFF is going to go and implement that agenda, or they're voting for another reason. They're voting to hold the EFF accountable to those issues, because it could be either or. If they're saying, we are giving the EFF a mandate because we trust that the EFF is going to go and deliver on that, then that is voting for the EFF. They're voting for the EFF and for their agenda. But they could also be using their vote to hold the EFF accountable. What do I mean by this? A friend of mine named John Taylor is an organizer around Black communities in the USA. And what John once said to me has always stayed with me. He said, they don't organize politically and decide that they're going to organize to vote in a particular candidate so that they can choose their champion, or because they found somebody that they, believe is always going to do the right thing. He says, sometimes what you're voting for is to choose your opponent. Because you know that whoever you're going to go and put into office, whoever's going to take up the seat in government, the seat in parliament, you're going to have to fight for them to do the right thing for the next 5 years. So he says, sometimes you vote for someone, you choose your champion. But sometimes you vote for your opponent. You vote for the person who's going to be sitting across the table from you as a voter for the next 5 years. And you want to think about whether that opponent, number one, aligns at least somewhat to your values, whether that opponent knows who you are, and whether you can remind that opponent that actually I put you in office by my vote. I actually stood out and publicly canvassed to make sure that you got elected, and I brought people with me, and so we helped get you elected, and therefore we have the right to speak when you don't do the right thing. And we have the ability to take you out at the next election. It reminds me of things that our parents would say to us. I brought you into this world, I can take you out. That's what it means to vote for your opponent, to be able to say to them, I voted for you, and therefore I can take you out. I'm not trying to be your member. I'm not trying to be somebody who only listens to what you say. I'm trying to be somebody who has hired you, who has put you in office, and for you to know that you have to listen to me for the next 5 years, that I'm going to hold you accountable to this particular agenda of 20 items and make sure that you actually go and do those things, or else I will use the same voting power that gave you seats to take those seats away in the next election. I think that's a really powerful differentiation. I think it's powerful to let politicians know that the vote that they're getting is not just a vote for free. Abahlali uses a very important phrase. They say we lend our vote to the EFF for 5 years. Not the EFF has all of our support all of the time. It's not indefinite. It's for a period of time. They are lending their vote for 5 years, and if you do not deliver on the thing that they want, they will take that vote back. As voters, are we really thinking about the fact that we are lending the vote? And if we do lend that vote, how do we make sure that those political parties actually listen to us and take us seriously? When Abahlali goes public, they are making sure that the EFF can never deny them in future, after the election, that they voted for them. They can never deny meeting with them, taking seriously their issues, because they know that group of people helped us get where we are. Now, the last thing I want to say about this for the party versus for accountability by that party is that in our current electoral system, in the past, what it's been is that parties just disregard the voter after the election unless they are their members. Parties are often heard saying, well, you're not our member, so we don't have to listen to you, because it's only the members that can influence what a party does after the election. By Abahlali doing what they've done, by not being members, but being vocal about who they're going to support, they have made themselves relevant as a constituency of the EFF without giving the EFF their membership and their loyalty. And I think there's a lot for our system to learn, and for us as people in communities, people in civil society, that when we actually, before the vote, start to leverage our collective power and start to leverage our support and start to say, this is what we want in exchange for our support, I think it changes the dynamics of our politics away from the power of the party and the members and the party bosses, more towards the power of citizens, voters, and communities. So, this is not the first time that Abahlali Basemjondolo have decided to publicly declare which party they're voting for. In 2014, Abahlali came out and said they are going to be voting as a bloc, as a constituent, for the DA. And now this is a party that is almost like on the other end of the spectrum in terms of Abahlali, what Abahlali stands for, what Abahlali fights for. Private land rights has always been a part of something that the DA speaks about, and Abahlali is looking for communal land rights. So just on their core fundamental issue, Abahlali is saying, we're going to be voting, and our vote is going to go to the DA. Now, people might say, well, Abahlali, why would you do something like that? Why are you voting for a party that doesn't stand for the things that you stand for? Well, there are a number of reasons. Firstly, voters don't just make decisions based on ideology alone. Now, in the case of the EFF and Abahlali, you might say, well, that is very ideologically aligned, so they're making an ideological choice. Even in that case, I'm not so sure that it's just an ideological choice they're making. They're also making choices about how big the EFF is. I mean, there's a party called the Land Party. Abahlali might want to vote for the Land Party, but the EFF is bigger, so it might make more sense to go with a bigger party. So there are many considerations to be made. But ideology is certainly not the only thing that people vote on. And we will know this, particularly undecided voters will know this. People who strongly align ideologically with the ANC, but are disappointed, or strongly align ideologically with the DA, but have issues with things that have happened in the party. There are the other reasons that we choose to vote that are not purely about ideology. And that's not to say that we are then being irrational if we do that. We are just showing that there are more considerations to be made. So what consideration might Abahlali have made in 2014? Especially because the EFF just came into existence. It was the first one that they were contesting. So in terms of having an ideological fit with their issues, the EFF already existed. The EFF was already untested at that point, may not have been as big, so maybe that's part of it. But I think that what they were doing is they were trying to use the vote not for the DA, but against the ANC. Why do I say that? And what does that mean? At that point, Abahlali was already in a position where it was struggling against the system, and the dominance of the ANC as government would be top of their mind in terms of why they have the struggles that they do. And so trying to make a political statement would be important to state to the ANC their dissatisfaction as informal settlement dwellers. But also, they were already at the point where they were subject to political threats of violence, political killings. And this was really important for them to make a statement about being unhappy about the political climate that they found themselves in. And so Abahlali doesn't say when it votes for the DA that they are voting affirmatively in support of the DA, but they are voting for the second biggest party in order to show that they can use their vote for against the ANC or against the establishment or against other parties, not for the DA, but against other parties, against the status quo, against the majority. I call this voting for accountability in general rather than accountability in particular. So it's the way that I've voted for most of my life. Somebody was asking me the other day to list all the parties or all the ways that I've voted since I started voting over 20 years ago now. And I realized I actually have lost track. I'm not sure all the parties that I've voted for, but I am sure about the reason I have voted each time and how I've made that selection. And the selection has never been, I'm voting for a particular party. I've never done that. I've never been a party member, and I've never affirmatively felt I am giving this party my vote because I believe in what they're saying, I trust what they're saying, and I trust that they're going to go and do what they say. In most cases, I have voted for what I call a balance of power. I have voted because I think that it's unhealthy for one party in a multi-party system to have such a huge majority. I think it's unhealthy even in a province for there to be overwhelmingly one party over the other, even in a ward. And so I vote to even out the balances of power. And so sometimes that's meant voting for a party that I think will really be, a big party. And incidentally, I've as such voted EFF quite a few times because they're a big party, and I think that they could disperse power at the top. But there are other times I've voted for very small parties. Sometimes intentionally, I've voted for a party I think has no chance of getting a seat. But why would I do that? Because when you vote for parties generally that are not going to be dominant, you are dispersing power. You're dispersing the vote. You're deconcentrating power from the top party or parties. You're giving more space for more expression, more people in the room, and more opportunities for accountability in general. So I'm also one of those people who's grateful for the fact that we can have up to 14 parties in parliament, so that you have different voices and different perspectives in the room, and you don't just have a ping pong between two parties or even three. I think more diverse perspectives in the room is healthy for a democracy. People having to persuade each other is healthy for a democracy. People who have particular issues that they care about or particular constituencies they're part of being represented in the room in parliament, I think is important. And so I like the diffuse power that voting for smaller parties has given in the past. But more importantly, I really think that it's important that we think about coalitions particularly and having more parties in the room as an important mechanism to make sure that there's reasons for people to hold to account. See, unlike most people, I'm not afraid of coalitions. I'm not afraid of having multiple parties at the table. I'm not afraid of the messiness even of that, because that's the only way that accountability can come about. That's the only way that you have a robust space for contestation of ideas. The dominance of one party limits ideas. The dominance of a few parties limits ideas, limits contestation, limits the battle. And it actually also makes it easier for people to do the wrong thing. The more people who are in a room, the harder it is for the wrong thing to happen without somebody saying something. And I'm going to say this quite controversially. I want people in the room who are willing to pimp out of the room. And when it's only one party in the room or two parties in the room, it becomes too easy to collude. It's like when we're talking about big monopolies, white monopoly capital. The reason why it's problematic to have 3 or 4 big chains, retail chains, that dominate the whole market is because they could collude. We've seen it with price fixing for bread. You collude because there's only 2 of you. You're each other's only competitors. And so there's more opportunity for you to quietly in a corner decide that you're going to collude. The more voices and different interests are in a room, the harder it is for the wrong thing to be done without somebody speaking up and saying, this is wrong, this is not the right thing to do. My best example for this from the 2019 election, and I didn't vote for them, but I think everybody who did vote for them would agree with me, is the ATM. The ATM got 2 seats in parliament from 2019. But as a small party, they have managed to have a very loud voice. Their constituents are mainly from the Eastern Cape, or have traditionally mainly been from the Eastern Cape, and from a church grouping. However, they've not limited themselves to issues related to the Eastern Cape. They've taken on some of the big issues of accountability in Parliament. They've been very vocal on the Pala Pala issue. They've been very vocal on questions around migration. They have taken on big national issues and had a voice in the public discourse and around the table. In the city of Johannesburg, they've actually gotten seats in the executive of the council. So they've managed to, as a small party, have a voice that has been important. They've taken issues and used the power that they have to particular kinds of information in Parliament to be able to go to the public protector on issues. So they've used a very small percentage of the vote, less than 1% of the vote, to actually have a big say in the room. And I can tell you for free, big parties are not going to just talk fast and loose around ATM MPs. Why? Because they don't know if they're going to just toe the line and allow things to slide. They may actually speak up. And that for me is evidence of why it's important to have multiple voices. You know, in this election, it might be hard for an Abahlali to say, you know, we're going to use our vote for the DA or voting DA in order to bring accountability. Because I think it's become harder just to do that, especially with big parties. Big parties have a lot more at stake. Their agendas are higher. Their tactics are, changing all the time. I mean, this week we've had the DA's very strange ad. That's very controversial ad. That kind of controversy can put a party off or a constituent off from voting in a way that you use the party tactically, because there's a lot more at stake. But I do think that even their choice to use a party to punish, to hold accountable, or to create a greater sense of accountability is an important one that teaches us something as the electorate about the fact that we don't always have to vote for a party. Sometimes we can vote against another party using a party's vote, or we can vote for accountability. And I think those are valid options that Abahlali's vote has given us to think about. So Abahlali's choices, their voting choices, are helping us think through the fact that when we vote, we're not just voting for a party, that we don't even have to vote affirmatively for a party. We can do different things. There are different tactics and different strategies. And so as we stare down the barrel of the 2024 elections, the 29th of May, I just want to go through what I think we all can be thinking about in general in terms of how to make our voting choice. And let's reflect on that, as individuals, as communities. I think the first thing I would ask everybody to think about is that before you choose the party that's going to get the X next to their name on the ballot, I think we all need to ask ourselves, what is it that we want the election to do for us? And that starts with, what are the issues that we care about? What issues do you really care about? What are the things that really keep you up at night when it comes to this election, and when it comes to this country in general? And how can this election help you get those things resolved, right? And we all have those things, whether they're about us personally and the circumstances we find ourselves in, be it a lack of jobs, water, sanitation, whatever it is, or the broader impact that misgovernance or poor politics has had on the rest of the country, our sense of stability, our sense of safety. Let's just narrow down what it is that we actually care about. And I think that if you can come up with at least 2 or 3 big things that are important to you, issues that are important to you, it then helps you look for parties that actually match that. And you can do the thing that Abahlali did for yourself. You can say, here are the 3 things I care about. Let me go and look at every party's manifesto, every party's interview, every party's debate, and see if there are parties who align with the things that I care about. Now, this requires a proactive approach to voting rather than a reactive approach, which I think most of us have had, where we wait to see who's on the menu. We wait to see what they bring up. We wait to see what their manifestos say, and to be convinced by them that those are the issues that should matter. I actually think, again, it's the other way around. I've often said that voting is the process of hiring and firing, and we as the voters are the ones doing the hiring and the firing. We are expecting the employees to actually tell us what they want to do. They tell us what their KPIs are, what their job description should be, and then we decide whether we hire them. I think it's the other way around. We must decide what the job description should be. We should decide these are the issues we want worked on. So if I care about education and the infrastructure issues in education, I'm looking for parties that have got infrastructure in their manifestos. I'm asking every party, what is your plan for education infrastructure? And only those parties who care about it are even worth considering. Then at least I have something, if I want to vote for someone, I have a reason why I'm choosing them. If I want to vote for a champion, I can say, this is my champion. But also, if I want to vote for accountability, I also need to know what the things are I care about. And so that I can then say, if I've given a party my vote, I can at least hold them accountable to things that I care about and that matter to me. And so I think the first thing is really choose the things that are important to us and decide how we're going to assess parties based on the things we care about rather than things that they care about. The second thing is to not feel like we have to vote for a party that we love or are loyal to or belong to. That sometimes we can actually vote because there's a party or there's a thing that we are unhappy about, that we want to register protest or discontent. Many of us in that situation have chosen to stay at home in the past. We've decided, no, the way I'm going to protest against the party, the system, the way things are, is I'm just going to stay at home. I'm not going to choose another party to vote for because I don't trust any of them. I don't know any of them. I want to say that actually makes it easier for the parties you think you're protesting against or trying to register discontent with or trying to show that you're not happy about things with. It makes it easier for those parties to get more seats in parliament. And this is just purely a math thing, right? So showing up to vote versus not showing up to vote is about whether or not parties have to work harder for votes or not. So, I mean, it's a simple maths equation. If only 100 voters showed up, right? You need 50% of those 100 votes to get 200 seats in parliament. And so if 100 people show up and 60 of them vote for a particular party, that party will get 220, let's say, seats in parliament. Great. They got 60 votes. If 200 people show up to vote and that same party gets 60 votes, they only get half of the seats that they were going to get if only 100 showed up. They only get 110 votes or 110 seats. That's a huge difference. The more people show up, the harder it is for parties to contest the elections and just get seats. We think opposite from that as voters. We think if fewer people show up, they'll feel bad that fewer people showed up. No, they won't. Parties only want the people who are going to vote for them to show up. Because, and I say this often, if only 5 people showed up, the election would still be valid. And if all 5 of those people were party leaders and they all just voted for their individual parties for themselves, they would split the country in 5 ways. And there's nothing you can say about it because they are 100% of the voting population. They're 5 people, but they would be 100% of the voting population. If all 5 of those people voted for one party, that party would get 100% of the vote, regardless of the fact that it's only 5 people, because it's the voters that show up that decide. And so when you don't show up, you make it easier for parties, not harder. It's not a protest to not show up. It is actually a opting out and leaving it up to the parties to vote for themselves. And so I want to encourage particularly young people, even if you don't know who to vote for, then decide that what you're going to vote for is yourself. You're going to vote for the country. You're going to vote for accountability, and you're going to vote for a country where people have to work hard in order to occupy the highest office in the land. So you can vote for smaller parties. You can vote for parties you don't even know. You can vote for parties that you have researched and you feel, at least if I vote for this party, I'm not doing harm, even if I'm not going to change the country in a significant way. But if you don't show up, or if you show up and you spoil your ballot intentionally, you are not making it harder for political parties that you want to show that you're unhappy with. You're making it easier. And so I think it's really important that the number one tactic is actually showing up, is actually making sure that the election is competitive. And those people who we want them to know that it's not going to be easy for them to just continue doing the things that we don't like and that they do. The best way to do it is to show up. The final thing that I think we learn from the Abahlali story in terms of how you're going to be making your voting choices is to think about, especially in contexts where we are really, dissatisfied with the status quo, to really just think about how do we bring more accountability into the system? How do we make sure that there's accountability? Sometimes voting for a smaller party means that it's easier to access that party when you want to, say, in between elections, say, I'm unhappy about this. I don't want for this to happen in parliament or in government. These are the issues that I have. Smaller parties may give you greater access to your representatives. Bigger parties may not. Bigger parties may actually make it harder. Sometimes it also means having to think about whether you want to join a political party, especially in the bigger parties where membership will matter a lot. Sometimes you have to make that kind of decision for the sake of accountability. Give yourself a voice after the election by knowing who you're voting for and letting them know you vote for them. I think signaling where your vote goes is a really important part of the journey. And I know our vote is our secret. And the reason why we say our vote is our secret so that people don't feel intimidated to be able to say. But I do think we have to increasingly have the culture of being able to say, listen, I voted for you and I have expectations. And even if you did not vote for people who get into parliament, let's say the people who you voted for don't get into parliament or don't get into legislatures, we must all remember that whoever does make it there represents all of us all the same. And so we still need a voice. But I think if you want to have more accountability, dispersing the vote is important, declaring your vote is important, and making sure you follow up for accountability is absolutely important. And so I hope this starts us thinking down a path of how to make better voting choices, how to vote not only for parties, but for the kind of South Africa that we really want, and for the kind of government in the next 5 years that we really think, at minimum, we can hold accountable, if not make sure that they deliver.